Hello everyone, I'm James Harkins, host of This Week in Texas History, a weekly show that is part of the Save Texas History program. Save Texas History is brought to you by Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office. If you love our state's history and want to make sure that it lasts forever, please visit savetexashistory.org and consider making a tax-deductible donation. Today, we have Bryan McAuley, manager of the San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site, as our guest. Bryan is the site manager of the San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site, operated by the Texas Historical Commission. In this capacity, he oversees day-to-day operations of this public history facility located approximately 45 miles from downtown Houston, just north of Interstate 10. He also serves as the remote manager of the Fannin Battleground State Historic Site. Bryan has been with the Texas Historical Commission since 2008, when he joined the newly formed Historic Sites Division. Bryan, thank you for being here and being willing to talk Texas history, a subject that I know you are very passionate about. How's everything going in these very odd times?
We've been reopened since May and are serving a smaller crowd than normal, but some really interesting history people that are excited to come out to the site. So we're having fun.
Yeah, one of the reasons that we wanted to invite you to be on This Week in Texas History is because of all the exciting things that are happening at San Felipe. San Felipe is not that far from where you're from, as you grew up in Angleton. And before you were working as a site manager, do you recall ever visiting San Felipe and as a kid? And can you kind of talk about what it was like back then versus what it is like today?
So I did grow up in Brazoria County, kind of in the footprint, a significant footprint of Austin's colony. And I was a self-identified history nerd from a pretty young age. I specifically remember we had a family reunion at the state park here, where we spent some time at the historic site as well in 1984. So that was a big gathering of a lot of my kin. In terms of change, the site hadn't changed a lot really since the 70s, before it transferred to the Historical Commission in 2008. And I was privileged to be brought into that agency as part of the new Historic Sites Division. And like you said, about 2009, was committing a lot of my time, mostly full-time, to San Felipe.
There has been a tremendous amount of growth at San Felipe just within the last 2 or 3 years. And it's work that you have been very passionate about, whether it be fundraising or just kind of garnering support for some really neat projects. Can you talk a little bit about some of those projects that are happening at San Felipe right now, and where we started from and where we are now and where you see us going in the future?
Local stakeholders, I'm privileged to stand on the shoulders of a lot of people who've carried water for this project over really the last 50 years, and I could make the argument for the last 100. Going back to the 1970s, certainly there was an interest by local stakeholders to better tell the story, to figure out a way to do it. And so they began a number of things, including the 1960s, the earliest museum experience here associated with the story. And then coming up into the 2000s, there was a concerted effort to start exploring what was left in the archaeological resources that were here. So when I came on board in 2008, I knew a lot of the players. I was very privileged to have worked with some of the stakeholders before, through the Trails Program, through previous work I did in Fort County, and was really able to take advantage of their passion and their excitement. So, as you noted, a lot of the early effort was just sort of creating a beachhead here. How do we get staff to a site that we didn't own a building at? How do we start interpreting a story that had been neglected in a lot of ways over the decades by many, many different people who were struggling to figure out how to tell the story. And then by the time, really around 2015, we started getting serious about a visitor center. In terms of where we are, my staff and I have got a fabulous professional staff, and we very much see this as a work in progress. So it's great that we have this new visitor center that opened in 2018 that can better convey this story to our visitors. But we're also working on some outdoor exhibitry. We have big plans for ongoing public archaeology that, if we do it well, will extend beyond my career. I'll be retired and we'll still have archaeology to do and things like that. So I think there's a great future for San Felipe.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the major milestones so far, maybe with the construction of that visitor center, and what that means for San Felipe?
You're absolutely right. A big milestone was just getting the money in hand to proceed. And there was a lot of contemplation after the transfer of sites in 2008 about whether this site was going to kind of fit the typical mold of a relatively small visitor center at a state facility, or whether it had a more significant story to tell. And it took us a while to flesh that out. The printing press component is part of the permanent exhibit, part of what you see behind me. And it's a significant part of our story. So in terms of those obstacles, we had to navigate getting people on board, particularly with fundraising. We raised close to $5 million, between $4 and $5 million in private funding.
The city was burned in 1836. It sat essentially empty for 100 or so years, I suppose, until the around 1936, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about the town being rebuilt and what the inspiration behind that idea was, and what you hope to see as the final stage of that project?
The visitor center that I'm standing in opened in 2018, so that really was that first effort in April of 2018. And as you know, we're trying to bring this story to light to help people understand more broadly some of what was here. The broader town of San Felipe tried to revitalize in the early mid-19th century. Ultimately, in terms of the historic site, the state acquired this property in 1940, and that's where the centennial statue of Stephen F. Austin has been since the 1930s. It's been the place people have come to look for this story, even though it's been difficult to find. For us, in terms of getting to this point, we had to acquire land, we had to raise money, we had to do archaeology to clear the location we wanted to construct on. And then to your point, the place where the primary buildings we're reconstructing or giving impressions of existed in the main core of the business downtown district. It was essentially ranch acreage for the last 150 plus years. So there hadn't been any redevelopment, there hadn't been anything that impacted those areas, which is both allowing us to explore them archaeologically and then grab a vision of how we can bring them to life here. So our intent is we're taking one very densely occupied part of the business district that had buildings connected to really important stories for us. A de facto courthouse building, a hotel tavern building that ended up having multiple use and has some connection to Santa Ana's migration through the town after it was destroyed. We have a schoolhouse building. We're going to have a printing shop. It's not the story you see behind me. So we've got a number of great pieces. Part of that hotel's operation involved commercial foodways. So we're going to build an outdoor bake oven, have a kitchen, and the kind of things you'd expect to see in a traditional living history site.
Wasn't Angelina Eberly, wasn't she in San Felipe?
She absolutely was. So when we have visitors from Austin, we often talk about her story. And of course, so it's fun for us. And really importantly to us, she narrates the 2 short films that we use to open and conclude this full exhibit here.
She was involved in the Archives War that involved the Texas General Land Office. And she was actually the woman who notified the townspeople in Austin that Sam Houston was sending government troops to take the archives out of Austin and remove them to Houston. And so by her firing the cannon at the GLO, she was able to really bring attention to what's going on. And she's become a almost mythological figure here in Austin, because if it weren't for her, the state capitol and republic capitol may not have been here in Austin. And now there's a statue in downtown. So I think it's real neat that she had an amazing life in San Felipe as part of the construction of that town. And then she moved and came to the new capital of Texas, and she had a whole nother chapter that's worth exploring. Can you tell us a little bit more about Stephen F. Austin, a little bit more about the archaeological work that's been going on at San Felipe, and maybe what you've learned more about Austin, more about the colony, more about the town site, and really anything new that has really been uncovered over the last couple of years through the extensive work that y'all are doing?
I was surprised at the number of people who would engage our stakeholders with the suggestion that if there was an important story to tell at San Felipe, it would have already been told, that it would have been pulled together in the 60s and 70s when a lot of bigger museums were coming online across the state. And so there was a little bit of resistance from people who said, what can you possibly learn? The town was destroyed. We know what we know about Stephen F. Austin. There's nothing else we can have. So I'm proud to say we've put a great team together of researchers and archaeologists and done some really deep dive research, both in archival records, which involve agency amongst many, and also in archaeological work, which, as I alluded earlier, should be ongoing really for a couple of decades if things go the way that we hope to. We've learned some interesting things, not just about Stephen F. Austin, but about a lot of the town members that were here, sort of the way that history can obscure stories sometimes by how it's selected and how it's presented. We've had a great opportunity to find undertold and missing stories of people that we can bring to light. We've certainly learned things about Austin as well, and we benefit from ongoing research. There are plenty of scholars. Andrew Torgett at the University of Texas is doing some great work that's helped us identify some stuff. And of course, We are big fans of Greg Cantrell's biography of Stephen F. Austin, which, even though it's pushing 20 years old now, is a great resource for us as well. What Greg didn't have the benefit of was much knowledge of the town. So, like I said, we learn as much as we can through deep dive, archival research, through some of this archaeology that we do the best we can to connect to our archival and historical understandings of the town. Some of my favorite things about Austin can seem a little trivial sometimes. I didn't realize that when he was at college in Kentucky, he had a very brief flirtation with a woman who would go on to become the mother of Mary Todd Lincoln, which is an odd kind of a cocktail party fact, but it's an interesting one in terms of the life of a man who never married and never had children here on the Texas frontier. More importantly, we've gathered better appreciation of Austin and how he navigated his political situation. Just this week, I was reading through some of the copies of the Telegraph and Texas Register, this famous newspaper I mentioned to you, and was reading Austin's very staunch advocacy for independence right around the turn of the year between 1835 and 1836. That I think a lot of our visitors come here painting Austin in a camp of peaceful appeasers and many of the other Texans as the revolutionary hotheads. And so you have Austin really identifying himself at a time that Mexican leadership is also giving him that label of being a firebrand and a revolutionary. So that's an interesting part of our story.
Austin really evolved from wanting to have measured peace to then being imprisoned and then really coming back to Texas and really being very strongly advocating for revolution. He's got a really interesting story. You mentioned that you've learned a lot more about some of the other members of Austin's colony who maybe lived in San Felipe. Is there somebody in Austin and San Felipe that you would consider as having just an interesting story that you like to share with other people?
There was an enslaved woman that was brought here, and actually her story is related to one of the buildings that we're trying to represent in our new outdoor exhibit. And she also was affiliated with the Bake Oven that I mentioned. Her name was Celia, and came to be Cecilia Allen when she was manumitted or given her freedom in 1832. She had a very challenged legal journey for many reasons, partly having to do with the complications of slavery as an institution and its legal status or lack thereof in Mexico, partly having to do with some odd shenanigans by the men who presumed to own her, who created some weird paperwork of IOUs and different note-keeping back and forth. And ultimately, after her freedom had been given, she finds herself in court having to defend her legal status based more on the actions of the people that freed her than anything she herself had done. At one point, she hires William Travis, who's an attorney here in San Felipe, to represent her in this issue. Her case culminates in one of the first ever jury trials in Texas. So we've got a lot of legal scholars in Texas that are really excited about this. I was literally talking to a judge who loves history yesterday, Judge Ken Wise, who does a podcast on Texas history. And he was really excited about the prospect of doing a mock trial in our new courthouse building that would share some of these interesting stories. So I think there's some great future there. Celia's descendants, of whom there are many, include the current mayor of town here in San Felipe. And they also believe, their oral tradition is that she refused to evacuate when the town was being evacuated and burned, which would make her the last Texan of note on the west side of the Brazos here, and puts her squarely in Santa Ana's camp, where her family say she traded some milk with the Mexican Presidente and some other things to kind of keep her safe, herself and her children safe.
Well, that sounds like a fascinating story, and I'd love to learn more about that. And it sounds like over the next couple of years, we'll have the opportunity to learn more about Celia.
Sure.
One of the things that has made it to where I've gotten to meet you is through your work on the colony on San Felipe, and also about the connection to the GLO between Stephen F. Austin and his colony. Can you talk just briefly about the work and the resources that you've gathered by working with the General Land Office, and what you found and what others who are interested in this history might encounter if they come to the GLO as well?
The GLO has been one of our best advocates and most significant partners throughout this entire journey, not just because you hold great resources, but because you've taken this aspect of public history very seriously with digitization and making research materials available. So I was privileged early in my career with the THC to come to your research room and get a firsthand look at a book that was referred to as the Registro, Austin's Register of Families that are part of the Old 300, his first settlement contract. And then, of course, as you guys at your agency were working through a preservation answer for that document, we ended up kind of piggybacking along and ending up with a copy through a private donor that's here in our exhibit. So thanks, Mary Chandler, and thanks for your help with the GLO and putting that together. Obviously, the Spanish language land grants that are core to our story, the thing that was motivating people to come to Texas, are a big part of what we celebrate. I'm intrigued when you were talking about stories that maybe people didn't know. We learn a lot of these stories from folks that are on their own genealogical journey. Some of them are surprised when they come here, if they get here first, to realize how easy you've made access to their ancestors' documentation and things that are part of your collection. Particularly, I get a lot of folks who say, well, it'd be kind of cool to have the Spanish language land grant, but I couldn't read it. So, well, during the Republic, those were all translated. You can get both. Put them both on the wall. Let your friends and family enjoy that. So our visitors have really gotten a kick out of that. And again, very much based on your collection and directing people there for more support. Probably my favorite object in your collection is the connected map of Austin's colony. And I've also been privileged in my career to kind of see your agency navigate access to that. I think the first time I really got a chance to drive it around, somebody in the reading room, it may have been you actually, had a digital version up on a big flat screen that we were driving around, flying around that thing, which for people who don't know, this is essentially kind of a jigsaw puzzle map of Southeast Texas, of Austin's colony, that shows all of the land claimants over 5 different contracts that Austin issued land to by name. So it's a significant part of our digital exhibit here. We literally interact with it every day.
You mentioned the registro as a resource here at the GLO. One thing that is in that book, that is in that register of families for the colony, is a town plat of San Felipe. And I don't know if you realize this, but we actually digitized that town plat because of y'all asking. Can you talk a little bit more about that San Felipe town plat and maybe how that's informed some of the decisions that y'all have been making as far as maybe archaeological work or as far as setting up the site, and how that plat might fit into the overall scope of the project that you're working on?
I appreciate you teeing that up, James. That's certainly my second favorite piece of the collection that you have, and very site associated. And I think, as you know, we incorporated that plat map very significantly in the current permanent exhibit that we have. So part of our planning for this facility includes 2, what we like to think of as kind of walk surface interactive maps. So they're large scale maps that our visitors can stand on, and we use them as interpretive tools. The first one is an Austin map of Mexico, the broad region that he's coming to in 1821. But the second one is the plat of the town, which is where people culminate their exhibit on our outside patio. And the intent was to show people Austin's dream on paper, which is ambitious. It's reflected in that drawing of about a 1,000-acre town that he's trying to navigate and create. And then, of course, we were able to take visitors out there and show them how much of it was truly created, how much of it was just a figment of his imagination and sort of his vision and planning. To your point about how we use it, we certainly do a ton of research related to where we think people were. That does inform our archaeology and where we choose to look for structures and stories. More interesting to me in some ways, although that's important to our interpretation, the town government here has continued to rely on Austin's plat map when they do street work and street development in the original footprint of the town. So this may sound like I'm being critical, and I'm not. I find it fabulous. This is kind of a memory or a memoriam they utilize. I'm confident they've built streets that exist in town today that didn't exist in Austin's lifetime, that are named what Austin would have named them had he finished out the plat. So it's an interesting part of how we navigate and celebrate the story.
Bryan, one question that I like to ask all of our guests is, what is your favorite historical item, whether it be a map, a document, a weapon or painting or whatever it might be? What's your favorite piece of Texas history?
I've always appreciated the narrative aspect of history. I've always enjoyed the fact that it's a way to tell stories, and it's a way to tell stories that, if done well and done coherently and done with the right research behind them, are stories that you can share with a broader number of people. Right? If you think about family storytelling being very insulated and isolated, I like the idea of community and country and civic storytelling to be broad, things that we can all sort of chip into and weigh into, and in some ways contribute to. So from Texas history, I've mentioned a lot of things affiliated with this site are really important to me. And I'm stunned anytime I come to your offices and see that 8-foot map of Austin's connected map of his colony. that's just an amazing piece. And to know that it still exists warms my heart when I think about the job that I do to bring things to bear. And a lot of my approach as a historian has been based on documentary history. That's really something that I feel like helps us tell those stories. So ironically, I would say if I had to pick, in the summer of 1989, I was privileged to visit both Washington, D.C. and London in pretty short order. And on those trips, I saw the Declaration of Independence in person, and I saw the Rosetta Stone. And so those were things that made me think about kind of how we more broadly weigh this human existence and how we think about how those pieces impact us. So here in Texas, I love those kinds of things. I'm excited about connection to other objects, but I can get pretty giddy about archaeological pieces we find here that in my mind I can connect to some great story, even if they'll probably never be substantial enough that I can look them behind glass and let you come see them.
Y'all recently had an exhibit about photographs of people from Austin's colony. Because I thought that was a really neat exhibit, can you talk just a little bit about that exhibit, what it was called, and kind of what the idea was behind it?
Sure. So that exhibit actually is still in place. So we called it The Faces of Austin's Colony. And certainly it seems odd to do a photographic exhibit for a town that was destroyed before photography existed. But we had several different touch points on this. So our staff curator, Danielle Brissett, and I kind of embarked on this path of going out to see how many we could rustle up, with the criteria being people who settled in Mexican Texas within the footprint of Austin's colony and then lived long enough to be photographed. And of course, the third step is that photograph has to be excellent. We have to be able to get our hands on it. There are plenty of people who were photographed that those photos didn't exist anymore. So we have about 75 on display. Some of them are really stunning in their technology and their reflection of humanity. And our visitors have really responded well to it. Perhaps more importantly, I would say to you, as we think about what this facility is going to be in the coming years, we would hope that we plan this facility right in a way that allows us to continue to explore its footprint through public archaeology. And while we've done archaeology, I would tell people the best is yet to come there. Most of our public archaeology experience is still to be had. Our temporary exhibit gallery, we were very committed to in planning for this facility so that we could pivot and bring in stories that either didn't make the exhibit that we're learning more about now and want to share. So it's a great opportunity for people to learn some new things with us. And then the third part, of course, is that outdoor exhibit where we're going to be able to do all measure of programming. Over time, it will be a traditional living history site. It'll be a place where we host events. I mentioned to you earlier, we may have some history-loving lawyers come out and do some mock trials and things for us. So I think we can really revitalize a lot of the stories of the town using that as a backdrop.
I think what I'm hearing from you is that San Felipe is about to have a boom in historical interest. And I know that is going to be the case because of the proliferation of resources that are coming out about Stephen F. Austin, his colony, early Texas history, the Spanish and Texas time period in Texas history, whether it be the Digital Austin Papers Project, the Seeds of Empire book, resources here at the GLO, resources at the Briscoe Center, or any other number of places throughout the state, not to mention all of the archaeological work that y'all are doing today. I'd like to say that thank you to Bryan McAuley for being our guest. He's the State Historic Site Manager of San Felipe de Austin. Bryan, thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time.
I really appreciate having this opportunity, James. And like I said, your agency has been a great partner to us, and we look forward to continuing to explore that as we go forward. I would be remiss not to say we agree. We hope that boom is coming. We think we can see it too. This crazy pandemic time has been an interesting hiccup. People are primed and ready, and I think the story is coming to light at just the right time. Thanks so much for your support.
On behalf of Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office, thank you once again for joining us here. We'll be back next time with more This Week in Texas History.